I'll start by briefly introducing the organization to all of you. So, Center of Policy Research and Governance is a think tank based in India, specifically in Delhi, and it is aimed at promoting the involvement of young people in policy making and politics at large. So, we aim to create the right opportunities for the development of human capital and also the preservation of global security. Currently, we are working in the domains of economic policy, social policy, regional development, and governance. We have with us today Dr. Ramanan, who is the director of CPRG. He has a PhD from Delhi University and a master's in Dalit and Tribal Studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. He was a policy advisor with the Ministry of Education on national education policy. And alongside, he also writes for News 18, The Print, and Times of India on public policy and social issues. Thank you for chairing the discussion, sir. And next, I would like to introduce to you Mr. Veeresh Kanduri, who has kindly consented to be the moderator for the discussion. He is a Ministry of Foreign Affairs Taiwan Fellow and a visiting fellow at the Taiwan Security Studies. Previously, he worked for Max Security as an intelligence analyst and specialist. He is also a Young National Security Fellow at the Forum for Integrated National Security India and a Young Leader Fellow at Hawaii's Pacific Forum. He graduated from Beijing's Yenching Academy of Peking University in International Relations and Politics, following his graduation in Development Studies from TIS. Thank you so much for sparing time for us, sir. And our speaker today is Dr. Raghav Sharma, who is an associate professor and the director at the Center for Afghanistan Studies at Jindal Global University. Having completed his PhD from the University of Erfurt, he previously taught at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy. He has also been associated with the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi with a capacity as a visiting associate fellow, where he led 2 research projects on the Indian membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and examined the Indian and Chinese roles in Central Asia. In addition, he has been associated with the development sector, wherein he worked extensively across Afghanistan in his capacity as an international humanitarian aid worker and undertook consultancies for the Aga Khan Foundation and Community World Services in Kabul. Given your expertise in Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the ethno-political conflicts in fragile states, it's a matter of immense privilege to have you with us today, and we really look forward to your perspectives. Thank you for being with us, sir. I'll pass it over to Veeresh, sir, now.
Thank you, Gauri. Thank you very much for the kind introductions. I also look forward to Dr. Raghav's thesis. So let me share a brief description and introduction to the lecture we have now. Afghanistan is like one of the major hotspots currently, and it remained a hotspot the last couple of decades. But recently, it's a major hotspot in our border, in our region. So India and Afghanistan relations are very crucial. Even though we share a historical bond and cultural exchanges, India and Afghanistan also strengthened the bilateral relationship through the Strategic Partnership Agreement in 2011. We have Strategic Partnership Agreement with very few countries, and the partnership between India and Afghanistan raising to Strategic Partnership Agreement is a clear evidence of our significance and importance we give towards Afghanistan. Through the Strategic Partnership Agreement, India extended assistance to help rebuild Afghanistan's infrastructure and institutions across multiple sectors, including education, governance, agriculture, as well as defense. India is one of the first countries and the only countries that maintained a consistent stance and advocated for an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and inclusive process of peace and reconciliation. However, Afghanistan is the only country in South Asia with which India lacks an operational and functional geographical access, either through land or water. The lack of direct geographic access to Afghanistan holds multiple challenges for India to maintain its relations with Kabul and safeguard its interest in Afghanistan. Against such geographical limitations India has towards Afghanistan and Kabul, the rapid collapse of the Ashraf Ghani-led Afghan government, restoration of Taliban rule, along with the support of Rawalpindi, undoubtedly presents very serious potential challenges for India, especially on three fronts. The first is the threat of radicalization and terrorism from the lands of Afghanistan. We have diplomatic challenges in crafting counterterrorism response in the light of the ethno-political tensions within Afghan and the fragile domestic politics in the new global disorder. Afghanistan is considered as a gateway for India's interest in Central Asia, and we have laid large diplomatic investments and financial investments into our connectivity issues with Central Asia. The latest developments holds potential to destabilize Indian connectivity initiatives with Central Asia, which we have through Iran and Afghanistan, especially the question on Chabahar project remains to be answered. The third factor, the influence of extra-regional powers and their hegemonic rivalries. Afghanistan holds the key characteristics to serve as a new frontier for India-China tensions in the South Asia, as well as for great power rivalry for the US-China in the region. In this context, I request Dr. Raghav Sharma to share his research. He has a lot of on-ground experiences in Afghanistan. He has insights into ethno-political tensions within Afghanistan, and also he worked himself personally on Central Asian connectivity issues with South Asia and particularly India. Thank you, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank the CPRG team actually for initiating, I think, this discussion on Afghanistan, which I think comes at a very critical juncture, so to speak, because the developments that are unfolding in Afghanistan are, of course, going to foremost impact the Afghans most profoundly, but they will leave an impress on shaping the larger regional landscape in terms of geopolitics, in terms of issues of connectivity, so on and so forth. So I've been asked to, look at Indo-Afghan ties in the context of these developments that have been taking place. So over the course of, I think, the next 20 odd minutes or so that I have, I'll try and walk you through some, some aspects of Indo-Afghan ties, trying to situate it in the larger regional context, particularly looking at, how developments in Afghanistan are viewed in neighboring Pakistan, and what does the changing regional landscape, particularly the positions of countries like Russia, Iran, and the role that China has acquired, what are its implications? What are some of the challenges actually that lie ahead for India as developments unfold in Afghanistan? There would be issues that perhaps flag but may not be able to flesh out in detail or may not touch upon at all. But you're welcome to sort of raise them in the discussion at greater length. Afghanistan it's a fascinating country with a very complex social and political landscape, right? And therefore, it is no surprise that many a times analysts, many a times intelligence agencies have got Afghanistan wrong. The speed with which the Taliban ruled over in Afghanistan took everybody by surprise. Just like the CIA, for instance, got Afghanistan wrong in 1989 when they anticipated that Najibullah's government would collapse within weeks, if not days, after the Soviet retreat in 1989. Najibullah actually outlasted the Soviet Union by a couple of months, and he lasted for close to 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal of from Afghanistan. While in 2021, the CIA predicted that Kabul could fall in about 6 months after the withdrawal of American troops. Yet again, the CIA got it wrong, right? As did many other intelligence agencies. The Taliban captured bulk of Afghanistan, between the 6th and the 15th of August, 2021. And the United States had not even pulled out all its troops, actually, and everything really collapsed like a pack of cards. In India, which had already shut its consulates in Jalalabad and Herat much earlier, and in Kandahar and Mazar-e Sharif days before the Taliban got into these provinces, was sort of caught off guard by the Taliban's ascent in Kabul, like most other diplomatic missions. So the mission had to be sort of left in a hurry, and India struggled for about 36 to 48 hours to get their diplomats and staff out really of the country. Now, what really is striking is that in the days after the Taliban takeover, almost all diplomatic missions were shuttered in the country, except 4 that continued operations, infamously referred to as the BRICS countries: Pakistan, Russia, Iran, and China. And the operation of these 4 missions in itself, was a political statement of sorts. It offered an insight into how dramatically the landscape, the regional landscape, really had been reconfigured from the time when the United States had led a military intervention and toppled the Taliban, right? Interestingly, if you look at what kind of reactions the Taliban takeover generated, while Tehran was very circumspect and in fact later became critical of the Taliban takeover, probably because it feared losing control and credibility over its Hazara constituency in Afghanistan. Pakistan was absolutely euphoric over the victory that the Taliban had secured. In fact, Imran Khan would go on record to unabashedly declare that the Afghans had, quote, broken the shackles of slavery. But, the images that came out of Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, which were images essentially of chaotic scenes at the Kabul airport, where you had thousands and thousands of civilians struggling to flee. The not so well-known scenes at border crossings of Spinbulak and Chaman with Pakistan that, didn't really get much media coverage, attest to how Afghans really were reacting to the Taliban rule. They were reacting with fear. They were reacting with a lack of trust in the words of the Taliban because their actions were not matching the words of the leadership. This is clearly not how breaking shackles of slavery looks like, as Imran Khan would like everybody to believe. Many Afghans one talks to perceive the recent developments really not so much as a victory of the Taliban as a victory of the GHQ in Rawalpindi. And they brand it really as a process of colonization of Afghanistan by Pakistan. And the fears essentially that the Afghans have harbored vis-a-vis the Taliban remain, I would say, fairly well-founded, not only in light of the past history, but very credible reports, including several first-hand accounts that have been shared by my friends, by my colleagues, students, institutional partners, many of whom are being hunted down by the Taliban. They've been house-to-house searches. And this is not just anecdotal evidence one is citing. The UN, which otherwise has been, frankly, a mute spectator to most of the events in Afghanistan, itself has confirmed and reports that the Taliban have been conducting searches. They say something during the daytime, but essentially disappear people at nighttime, pretty much like what the communists apparently did when they were in power, right? In fact, the UN estimates that 500,000 Afghans are likely to flee the country in the aftermath of the Taliban takeover. Most of them are young, educated and skilled Afghans. And again, this is important because remember, Afghanistan is a country which has a youth bulge as far as its demography is concerned, right? And this will have repercussions essentially for Afghanistan in the long run. It is going to amplify the challenge of governance within Afghanistan, which will in the long term lead to instability and will create challenges for the region at large. We of course have a far fuzzier picture of the developments taking place in the countryside, which has received far less attention, but reports have been trickling in of excesses that have been committed by the Taliban in provinces like Malistan, Ghazni, Faryab, just to name a few, where there've been reports of executions. In fact, just yesterday there've been reports of former members of the Afghan National Security Forces being executed in Uruzgan province, which is the home province of Mullah Omar, who was the founder really of the Taliban. So Pakistan's Pyrrhic victory I think was very appropriately described by Hussein Haqqani in his article, I think is likely to foster reactionary Islamist groups who will, in all probability, acquire reverse strategic depth in Pakistan. And with India really being eased out, in a sense, from Afghanistan, not having any presence on the ground, this is also going to shatter somewhat rudely the myth that was peddled by the generals in Rawalpindi, that Afghanistan is home to 20 plus Indian consulates, and these consulates are spawning terror in Pakistan. Absolutely, I think, bizarre and baseless allegations of India being in cohorts with the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and trading groups like the Islamic State. Now, with India nowhere being there in the picture, it's going to be hard for Pakistan to really, peddle this myth and try and sell it to people who are naive and gullible. Now, one of the first things that the Taliban did as they captured most major Afghan cities was they freed thousands of Islamists who were held in Afghanistan's high security jails like Bagram and Pul-e-Charkhi. And, according to jihadi social media accounts, many TTP members, many Islamic State members were freed as the Taliban broke open these prisons. Amongst them is a man called Fakir Muhammad, who's the former deputy emir of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. Nur Wali Masood, who was the emir of the TTP. He also has renewed his oath of allegiance to the Taliban and their Islamic Emirate. He, in fact, described the Taliban victory in Afghanistan as historic and blessed. And this, again, is going to electrify the ranks of jihadists in the region at large and will have repercussions for regional security. Pakistan already has been witnessing an uptick in attacks by the TTP. So the TTP has been staging attacks on the Pakistani soldiers in districts like Bajaur, for instance, in Waziristan, right? In fact, as the Taliban race to victory, the TTP by August 2020 is said to have papered over its internal schisms and come together ready as a group, with Al-Qaeda playing a very important role in moderating the schisms within the ranks of the TTP. The TTP has also been issuing threats to residents in towns like Miranshah in North Waziristan, warning them against playing music, warning women against leaving their houses without a male chaperone, all of which is not getting covered actually in the press. More specifically, warnings have also been issued to journalists. More recently, I'm sure all of you are aware, there's a madrasa in Pakistan, in Islamabad, in the heart of the capital, flying the flag really of the Taliban. So these are all signs of the things to come. And I don't think these signs are very good, right? So the blowback, in other words, for Pakistan is going to be fairly intense. And this will, in some ways, certainly leave its impress as far as security for India is also concerned. Particularly, I think from the perspective of New Delhi, these developments will enhance both the physical and the ideological receptivity for a plethora of Islamist groups in the region. And this is therefore going to have repercussions in the long run. And the challenge of this really sort of becomes magnified because I think what we have, and I think India really needs to reflect on this, what we have in India is also an upsurge of, religious nationalism, which is being peddled in the political domain. And whether we admit it or not, whether we like it or not, this is going to have repercussions. And we've seen some traces of that with a very small section of Indian Muslims being attracted to, I wouldn't even say radical, but the reactionary ideology of groups like the ISIS, right? In staging attacks on religious minorities in Afghanistan, be it the Shias, be it the Afghan Sikhs, who were bombed by the IS, and who were also gunned by the IS. In fact, one of the gunmen, I'm told, was a Malayali Muslim. So I think India really needs to seriously reflect on where we are heading and whether we can afford this kind of enmeshment between domestic politics and foreign policy. Should we allow our domestic politics to color foreign policy decisions? Pakistan's Pyrrhic victory, of course, has been cheered on by Beijing, which again doesn't come as a surprise because Beijing has been one of the capitals that has had excellent working relationships with the Taliban from the 1990s. They've always kept the door open through their patrons in Rawalpindi. Beijing and the Taliban, both of whom are ideologically dogmatic and autocratic, are fairly happy to get into bed with each other in the hope that, Beijing hopes that this will prevent contagion of reactionary Islam in Xinjiang. Is going to whittle down Beijing's dependence on Rawalpindi to secure its interest. It will provide stability for its investments in the region, whereas the Taliban also feel that this is going to whittle down their dependence on Rawalpindi. It will give them a larger basket of options diplomatically as well as economically. And Beijing has already started the process of trying to bankroll the Taliban regime. So, clearly this is, and Beijing has for very long looked at Afghanistan through the prism of Rawalpindi and not really on its own terms. And this is something, India should have perhaps woken up to earlier because this, Beijing has been showing growing interest in Afghanistan for well over a decade now, right? And people, including myself, have been writing about this since 2010, that, this is something India needs to watch out to. And today, India is confronted with a situation where Beijing and Rawalpindi essentially loom large over much of its western neighborhood. The challenge, I think, for India is also confounded, is amplified really by the fact that Moscow has also thrown its hat into the ring, driven originally, I think, by the delusion that the Taliban could be partners in rolling back the threat posed by the Islamic State. Moscow was also driven into this alliance because of its weakening linkages with New Delhi to an extent, but more importantly, it was driven into the arms of Beijing owing to its friction with the United States over a range of issues, starting from more recently the events in Crimea and Syria and Venezuela, to the color revolutions that were promoted in the post-Soviet space, to the installation of missile defense shields, to name a few, which essentially have encouraged a reset between Moscow and Beijing. And Moscow's outreach to the Taliban, in turn, was facilitated to a considerable degree by Tehran, right? And Tehran, for its part, preferred extending tactical support to the Taliban, shaped considerably in response again to Washington's policies vis-a-vis Tehran, right? And this shouldn't really come as a surprise, because much as, for instance, was being talked about ethno-political tensions in Afghanistan, ethnicity is a very fuzzy concept in Afghanistan, and political alliances have not always followed the logic of ethnicity. People very often forget that Iran in the 1990s first endorsed the Hizb-e-Wahadat, which was a predominantly Hazara Shia party, to ally with the Taliban in 1995, until the leader of the Wahadat was pushed to his death by the Taliban, and subsequently, much to the displeasure of sections of the Wahadat leadership, pushed them into an alliance with the Jamiat-e-Islami. Ethnicity and politics don't always follow a neat sort of logic. So this really shouldn't come as a total bolt from the blue, as it were. So I think this absence of a congruence of interest between New Delhi, Moscow, Tehran stands out when you compare it to the 1990s, when essentially they had supported through Tajikistan the so-called Northern Alliance, right, better known as the Harkat-e-Shamal, or Movement of the North within Afghanistan against the Taliban. And this has reduced to a certain degree the room for maneuver as far as India is concerned, because India in the post-war period had largely predicated its presence in Afghanistan on the United States. In fact, India very steadfastly refused any engagement with the Taliban, even though as early as 2010, it had become clear after the London conference that for the international community, the question was not if the Taliban would be rehabilitated in Afghanistan, but the question was when would this take place and what would be the contours of this process, right? But for very long, we staved off any kind of engagement with the Taliban. And we were fairly late in jumping on to the process of opening channels with the Taliban. Coupled with these developments is the fact that Afghanistan's domestic political landscape has also undergone a dramatic reconfiguration since the 1990s. The erstwhile Northern Alliance is nowhere in sight. The Jamiat-e-Islami, which was the principal and a very important constituent of the Northern Alliance, has splintered, right? There are at least two major factions of the Jamiat led by Salahuddin Rabbani and Atta Muhammad Noor. The Tanzims, that is the parties that were seminal in the Afghan jihad, essentially have weakened in the post-war period, partly because these parties were not allowed to function officially as political parties. And the excuse given by Hamid Karzai was that political parties generally have a bad history in Afghanistan, and a bad association with past history, so we're not going to allow political parties to function. And the fact that, leaders, particularly second generation leaders in these tanzims, have long been divorced to a certain degree from their core constituency, right? And this is again significant because if you look at the way the Taliban descended across Afghan provinces, they actually didn't start from their strongholds in the south and southeast. They took many provinces in the west and the north of the country, including Badakhshan. So, there has been a certain degree of disconnect between the leaders of these tanzims and their co-constituencies. And today we also have a situation where most of these so-called strongmen, who are also referred to as warlords in the English discourse, like Atta Muhammad Noor or Dostam, they've either tried to strike a deal with the Taliban or they have run away. So Dostam and Noor have run away and they've been hedging their bets. Others like Mohakif, who is in the Hizb-e-Wahadat, have tried to strike a deal with the Taliban, although they've not got very much in return. Even the nascent resistance that is taking shape, or that was rather taking shape in Panjshir, has been quelled to a considerable degree, and it confronts a dramatically altered geopolitical landscape outside of Afghanistan in the region. So all of this really seriously amplifies the challenge at hand for India. I don't know how much time I have, so I will try and be a little quick. If I'm out of time, just let me know. Now,
you can continue for 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes.
Sure. Thank you.
India clearly has reason to be concerned by these developments that have been unfolding in Afghanistan. It has watched these developments largely as a spectator. And given the close nature of the relationship between the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda that remains active in Afghanistan, given the enmeshment of the Taliban with the Haqqani network, which has been responsible, amongst other things, for the deadly attack on the Indian embassy in Kabul, and now occupies key positions, ironically, in the Taliban's cabinet, are all sources of concern. The Haqqani network, in fact, was described, and I think rightly so, as a veritable arm of the notorious ISI of Pakistan. And it's noteworthy that soon after the Taliban captured the province of Kandahar, Jaish-e-Mohammed, who was the chief of Masood Azhar, who was the chief of Jaish-e-Mohammed and was released as part of the swap that took place over the course of the IC-814 hijacking crisis. He visited Kandahar in August, soliciting support for the activities of the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and has been openly celebrating the Taliban victory. The Taliban has in the past had a history of nurturing constituencies that have been used against India. It has set up camps in areas like Khost and Nuristan to train not just groups operating in Kashmir. So Khost is important because Khost is, belongs to the area of Loya Pattia, where the Zadran tribe is strong, and the Haqqanis actually belong to the Zadran tribe. And that is where many of these camps were set up. Nuristan is another province where you had groups like the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Lashkar-e-Toiba, that have aims of carrying out their agenda outside of Kashmir into the Indian mainland, have operated with impunity and with the backing of the Pakistani state. So India does have reasons essentially to worry. And the Taliban statements on Kashmir, certainly would have raised attention in Delhi, because this contrasts with their almost studied silence on developments taking place in Xinjiang, and is very much in sync with their patrons in Rawalpindi. They've both chosen to maintain studied silence on what is happening in Xinjiang. So India has reason to worry in terms of what new Taliban dispensation will bring. Now, while there are ample reasons for India to be concerned, I think India must keep its channels open with the Taliban, because we must remember that the Taliban is not a monolith, right? Any political movement is rooted in a certain social and cultural context, and the Taliban is no exception. The Taliban is riddled also with several internal contradictions, which have already been playing up in the run-up to government formation. And one of the contradictions that has been coming to the fore within the ranks of the Taliban has been the divide between, tribes, the Mashraki and the Junubi tribes, the tribes from the east and from the south, so from Kandahar and the Loya Paktia region. Coupled with this is the fact that the Taliban cabinet is not inclusive, right? No, it is inclusive only of certain sections of the Taliban leadership, right? It doesn't mirror the country's social heterogeneity. It certainly, of course, doesn't include any women. So this is going to make the task of stabilizing Afghanistan extremely challenging, and governance extremely challenging. It is going to make the question of the Taliban establishing its legitimacy challenging. And there is a possibility that these contradictions are likely to play out in the future. And India must keep this essentially in mind. And they could allow India an opening in the near future. More importantly, I think India should genuinely be worried about losing ground, not just politically and diplomatically, but also should be worried about the receding goodwill it has garnered through, I would say, a fairly productive engagement over the last 2 decades at the people-to-people level. India's silence on the developments in Afghanistan has been particularly striking, as has been its very botched up visa policy for the Afghans. So India went ahead and announced e-visas with a lot of fanfare, but has failed to issue a lot of these e-visas, right? Many actors who were allies of India looked up to the country for, some of the values that India espoused, feel very let down. They've been pretty much left to fend for themselves. Indian academic institutions have also lagged behind in being able to offer safe sanctuary to scholars, activists, lawyers, artists who are at risk, right? Not a single Indian academic institution, for example, is part of the Scholars at Risk Network, which is a global network meant to provide refuge to Afghans who are at risk. And this is not going to augur well for India in the long run, and would contribute to marking eventually a rupture of ties at the people-to-people level between India and Afghanistan. So India really needs to, I think, revisit its visa policy and recalibrate this at the highest level, and do so fairly quickly. India's invested in the Afghan people And all of that really stands, I think, at the risk of being undermined by what I think are fairly narrow domestic political considerations. So the government really needs to reflect on this, I think, seriously. Afghan academics, activists, lawyers, journalists, artists, members of the civil society, politicians, these are constituencies where India, has a lot of receptivity. I think they need to be conveyed to in unequivocal terms that they have a second home in India, right? Finally, I think India must also nurture some serious academic engagement with Afghanistan. A lot of the knowledge production in the country has for very long been dominated by the West, and for good reason. And Indians have a very limited and at times myopic view of the country. So it's a pity that, even though we are geographically and culturally quite close, India has very limited knowledge, genuine knowledge of Afghan society, polity, and culture. And this in the long run certainly hinders the pronouncement of informed public policy. And I think a Talibanized Afghanistan in the long run is going to be a country which will not be at peace with itself, and is likely to serve as a magnet for reactionary elements in the region at large. And, I think keeping this in mind, India needs to recalibrate its policy. It needs to also resist the temptation of going down the path of religious nationalism in a way that it begins to mirror and color. It begins to mirror in and color its foreign policy. This is going to have, I think, this is going to be counterproductive. Let me put it this way. So I think I'll end here. I'm totally out of time. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raghav. You touched on multiple facets of the Afghan crisis and India's challenges and opportunities in the Talibanized Afghanistan. So I would like to further brief us on the internal tensions within the government, or the coherence within the Taliban-centered government. And as you mentioned, Taliban is not any monolith. So what are the India's options to engage with any different factions of the Taliban? Do we have any viable options within the factions of the Taliban if Indian government or Indian actors beyond the government has to engage with the Taliban government or the civil societies? And also, I would like to one other facet for that particular question. So what is is there any role or influence of civil societies or non-governmental, non-fundamentalist or non-Islamic bodies on the current government? Does they have any influence on working or the operations of the government? Or do we, and what is the status of India's engagement with civil societies and non-governmental institutions in Afghanistan currently?
So let me, just give me a second. So let me begin with your second question first, right? In a nutshell, the status of India's engagement with civil society in Afghanistan, it is zilch. We have no engagement. Most people in civil society that you talk to, they express dismay, disappointment, and sense of betrayal at the fact that India essentially has kept silent and has not reached out to anybody, including, I can't name the people, but including, very senior people in the government, senior people in the ranks of diplomats, who are not only allies of India, but they've studied in India. India has been their second home. Eminent voices in the ranks of civil society who've spent considerable amounts of time in India in terms of education, training, etc. They have essentially been left high and dry. We've not even issued them visas. So there is no engagement. In fact, they're quite livid at the fact that, they put all their eggs in the India basket, so to speak. One diplomat I spoke to, whose family, for instance, was stuck. I said, why don't you send them to Tehran and they can come to India from there? And this particular diplomat, who's an ambassador in a country at the moment, he said, well, Our mistake was that we invested 2 decades with India, and we have no links. Our family doesn't have strong links with Tehran. So we really don't have an engagement at the moment with civil society in Afghanistan, and we fared very poorly on that count. Does the civil society have any influence on the current Afghan government? Not really. Because the current government, essentially has, if you have followed the news, it's essentially even barred protests. It has disbanded and dissolved the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, which had done some substantive work over the last 2 decades. It has dismissed most of the criticism that has been coming from the ranks of Afghan civil society, saying, well, this is not representative of, what the Afghan nation wants or what Afghan women want. We know what Afghan women want. So they've been fairly dismissive of what the civil society has been articulating. And I don't think they will have any substantial influence, because this is a government that is dogmatic. It's a theological government that is clearly not interested to engage with actors of civil society. In fact, again, as many of my friends tell me, my colleagues who I work with tell me that the Taliban has not even made a transition from fighting, being an insurgent force, to being a force of governance. So, about 3 weeks ago, they convened a meeting of at least 4 different NGOs in Kabul, and they told these chaps, you can carry on with your work in health and education, but give us a 10% cut in the projects that you implement. So they went and reported this to UN OCHA. And when UN OCHA convened a joint meeting, they flatly denied it. They said, oh, well, we never asked, it was misconstrued, which of course was not bought by the UN OCHA representative, who turned around and told them that, well, I mean, one person could have possibly misconstrued what you said, but it's very unlikely that people from 4 different NGOs are reporting the same thing to us. So, they haven't really made at the moment a transition from fighting an insurgency to governance, and their engagement with civil society is, the influence of civil society on them is nil at the moment, right? Internal tensions in the government, as I said, I think the principal tensions at the moment in the government have been between the tribes from the south of the country, so Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan, versus tribes from the east, that is Paktia, Paktika, Khost. And tribal politics is important in Afghanistan. It has been throughout Afghanistan's history, because, take for instance the fact that once the communists took over the country, from 1747 to 1978, Afghanistan was largely ruled not just by the Pashtuns. I mean, not only were Pashtuns the core power holders, but within the Pashtuns, it was the Mohammedzai, it was Duranis, and within the Duranis, it was the Mohammedzais who held core power. All of that changed once the communists took over. You had the Duranis being eased out of key positions of power, and the Ghiljais really dominated within the ranks of the Pashtuns. Now what you have today is that you have the Zadrans essentially trying to ease the Ghiljais and the Duranis out of core positions of power. And this is seen in the way, for instance, the Haqqanis are dominating, and wresting control of key positions of the government. And you look at who is the head of the government. It's Mullah Khund, who is a fairly unknown figure, with no credible political base of his own. So he's seen as somebody who wouldn't really challenge the writ of chaps like Anas Haqqani or Khalilur Rahman Haqqani, who have a certain ideological agenda essentially to pursue. So, there is this schism between the tribes from the south and the tribes essentially from the east, coupled with the fact that, the Taliban government or cabinet is not inclusive of Afghanistan's social heterogeneity, right? A question is, how do you define inclusivity? Is it you define inclusivity by saying that, well, we have 10 Pashtuns and you have 5 Tajiks and 4 Uzbeks? Is that an inclusive government? That's very problematic to define in the Afghan context. But what I can say is it certainly does not represents the social heterogeneity of Afghanistan, because not everybody is represented. So you can have a token representation of a Tajik or a Hazara, and I think a deputy minister of health has been appointed who's Hazara. But again, what Hazara is he? What is his political inclination? Right. So there are a lot of these factors that need to be taken into consideration. So these cleavages could potentially play out in the months and years ahead, particularly so as the governance, humanitarian and economic challenges intensify. And I think that's what India needs to keep an eye out for, coupled with the fact that India has been engaging initially covertly and now overtly sections within the Taliban, chaps like Stanakzai, Mullah Baradar. We've had a channel of communication with them. So I think we should keep that channel of communication open, and we should wait and see how these contradictions play out in the long run in Taliban, because clearly these contradictions were serious enough for the ISI chief to make a trip to Kabul, essentially to mediate cleavages that were playing up within the ranks of the Taliban. So I think India needs to keep a channel open. We certainly don't want a situation like in 1996, where we essentially ran into a black hole of sorts, where we had no channel to communicate with. And engagement doesn't mean that you legitimize the Taliban, right? But you keep a dialogue open. You see how these contradictions play out, and I think then India should develop its engagement, seeing in how these things will play out over the long run. So that's what I feel.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Coming from the domestic tensions and domestic politics towards India's side, like, how do you see the future of India's initiatives and investments within Afghanistan in the form of like hydropower projects or like agriculture or education, and also on the connectivity issues through Chabahar? What is the longevity? What is the sustainability for Chabahar now? Because recently, like, Afghanistan also expressed its interest into Pakistan's water through the CPEC. So how do you look at the future of Chabahar and also India's investments within Afghanistan?
See, India's investments in Afghanistan were largely predicated, something I flagged earlier also. Our presence was largely predicated on the military presence of America in a big way. And the biggest hindrance for India and Afghanistan has been geography. We are not geographically contiguous to Afghanistan, which in turn makes India dependent for geographical access, amongst others, to Iran. Right? And Iran is not an easy country to deal with for numerous reasons. Coupled with this is the fact that, while Iran has not always supported India on issues that are of core interest to India, like Kashmir, for example, at the same time, the Iranians, I feel, have a sense that India has made its engagement with Iran to a large degree contingent on its relations with Washington and Riyadh. And this has not gone down very well with Iran in the long run. So this is going to be a challenge for India to sort of balance its relations with Washington, Riyadh, and Tehran, all of which have competing aims. So the challenge for us is going to be able to effectively reconcile, these competing interests that they have. And India would have to find a convergence with each of these three capitals. That is important. Chabahar, I think, should not only be viewed as a project for connectivity to Afghanistan. It has to be viewed in a larger context. I think what India should work on is that, we should sort of use Chabahar and the ports of Bandar Abbas as a stepping stone to amplify our involvement in other projects like the INSTC, the International North-South Trade Corridor, right? Because in Afghanistan, while we worked in Chabahar, and the idea was that it will eventually be a stepping stone for connectivity to Central Asia, all of that was always contingent eventually on good security, right? And we had built this road of 210 kilometers or so in Nimruz province, which essentially was meant to connect the Chabahar road. And that road fed into, the Garland Highway in Afghanistan, right? And that Garland Highway in turn branched off towards Central Asia. But the problem in realizing the full potential of this connectivity was security, right? So that was a problem even when we had the Afghan Republic in place. So I think India needs to think in more innovative terms, and we also need to revisit the problem of bureaucratic inertia. So we promised the Iranians we'll build a rail line, and then we backpedaled on it. So I think all of this doesn't augur well eventually for India when your allies and friends eventually don't take your promises seriously, and this is a problem not just in the context of Iran, but also in Central Asia. In 2014, when we went to Central Asia for a study that the MEA had commissioned, many people in Central Asia, including people in government, said, well, I mean, India is nice, but the problem is, they promise a lot and then they actually don't deliver on many of those promises. So I think we really need to add more heft to our efforts that are geared towards connectivity. And Chabahar needs to be viewed in this larger context where you use these projects as an anchor really to push for regional connectivity beyond the context of Afghanistan. And more so, particularly when China has been amplifying its efforts for a very long time. Afghanistan was already in the ambit of the Belt and Road project by 2019 when they've connected Afghanistan by rail. So Nantong to Heratan, right? 2 weeks. It's another matter that, Afghans were not allowed to put any goods on to the trains that were going back from Heratan, but they've already got them into the BRI project. There's already been talk for some time of throwing open the strategically important and the ecologically sensitive Wakhan corridor, as part of the BRI, something again that India should have kept its ears to, which we haven't done, which is surprising because it's an area of immense strategic importance for India. It's an area which is also close to AIMI, where India has a military base but never admits to having one, where we've stationed Air Force chaps, but we say they're teaching computers. So I think the point is that we really need to get serious if we really want to be taken seriously. I mean, India needs to get over its bureaucratic inertia as far as dealing with issues of connectivity is concerned, and we need to invest really in seriously studying the neighborhood. We don't know our neighborhood very much. There's hardly any serious Indian contribution in terms of getting to know the neighborhood. Future of projects like education, etc. Frankly, it is very much in the lurch. Many Afghan students who've got scholarships, government scholarships, don't know what is going to happen. There is no clarity. The ones who are in India, well, the government has said, well, we'll extend your visas. The challenge has been one of implementation, where the government policy announces some policy, but it's being not being implemented, right? So we don't know what the future of all of this is going to look like. Now, if you want to sustain things like education, which I think India should, because that has created a fairly large constituency that is receptive to India in a positive manner, we need to have some kind of presence in the ground, and India needs to think quite fast in terms of how that presence is going to be. Is that going to be in terms of a scaled down diplomatic presence? But then that would perhaps be tantamount to, legitimizing the regime which is in power. Or would you like to maybe think of opening up a liaison office that represents your interests through another friendly embassy that is in operation? So I think India needs to very carefully calibrate what is it that it wants to do. So the future really hangs in the balance, and hydropower is an important thing that you flagged because I don't think we'll see any of the big hydropower projects going through because Iran, as it is, was opposed to Salma Dam and created a lot of hurdles in the realization of that project because water was flowing freely into Iran. So they were not particularly thrilled when the Salma Dam was completed. India had announced a Shatut Dam project, which would essentially begin damming up the Kabul River. I think the Pakistanis are going to be only too thrilled that that is not going to go through. And I don't think they'll allow the Taliban regime to essentially, go ahead with that project. Largely because that's going to, affect Pakistan's water security because, it's a lower riverine state. And Pakistan has always securitized the issue of water development in Afghanistan. So it feels it's being done deliberately by the Indians, essentially to starve Pakistan of water. Whereas the reality, on the other hand, is that Pakistan has mismanaged its water resources. Its water distribution between provinces is skewed heavily in favor of Punjab. And Afghanistan, has been in the midst of conflict for the last 4 decades, which has meant that it has never effectively been able to rehabilitate its agricultural sector. So it was but natural that when these projects were commissioned, it would generate friction, not just with Iran and Pakistan, but also with the Central Asian neighbors. So I don't think those projects are going to go through in the near term.
Sure. So thank you for that. And if you would allow me, I would go with my last question. Would you like to take it, Dr. Raghav? Yeah. So my last question, you also emphasized the role of China and the China-Beijing Taliban relations. So you also highlighted that it's a very theological based government. So the core interest of Taliban remains faith. And from the Deng Xiaoping era, China believed that social stability and social order is a key for economic development. But in the recent terms, Xi Jinping considers social order and social stability is like a core interest of China. And do you see Taliban's core interest of faith and Beijing's core interest of social stability and social order in Xinjiang context are very divergent? And how do you see in this context how far Beijing can rely on Rawalpindi to maintain its relations with Taliban? If we consider Taliban and Afghanistan as potential land for radicalization and a threat of terrorism, doesn't China has a similar concerns? How far Beijing can maintain or the social order in Xinjiang just by CPEC or its economic incentives to Beijing, to Rawalpindi? Thank you.
Okay, this is, I think, an important question. It's a very complex question that, frankly, doesn't have the easy or black and white answer. I'll begin with the last point that you made. How long can Beijing maintain social stability by offering economic goodies? This is always, this is a very pertinent point, and it's a very pertinent question, not just in the context of what we're seeing in Xinjiang, but in the context of conflicts around the world, right? Take for example, the turmoil that we saw in the Kashmir Valley, right? So many people would say, well, Kashmir would never be a viable independent state. And these chaps are absolute fools that they want to pursue a path of independence when they know that they're going to be economically dependent on India or Pakistan because they're landlocked. The reality, on the other hand, is that very often sentiments of, identity, sentiments of national belonging trump questions of economic viability, right? And when you look at most movements, be it in Kashmir, be it in Xinjiang, or even be it, the various jihadi groups that were operating in the 1990s, these were not simple contests for power. These are not simple contests for a redistribution of political, economic, or territorial resources. They're very often intertwined with calls for social justice, right? And they're seen essentially as two sides of the same coin, right? So while China may be delivering economic, material benefits, let's say, to Xinjiang, which is again questionable how equitably they are distributed, but that does not necessarily translate into legitimacy, which again is going to be problematic. How do you gauge legitimacy, particularly in a closed political space? It does not translate into legitimacy, and it does not necessarily translate, into long-term social stability, and it does not translate into addressing calls for social justice. So, I think it's a very myopic policy that in the long run is not going to help Beijing attain stability in Xinjiang for a multitude of reasons. Can Beijing rely on Pindi? I think the whole idea essentially of Beijing going out and striking out on its own in the context of both Afghanistan and Pakistan. Remember, in Pakistan, Beijing has signed MOUs with right-wing parties, including the Jamaat-e-Islami of Pakistan, which is a radical right-wing, hate-spewing party, saying that, well, we support the Jamaat's principled stand on Kashmir and they support the One China policy. So they've been hosting delegations of mullahs from Pakistan and Afghanistan. They've hosted delegations of the Taliban. And the Taliban has very happily said, well, everything is well and good in Xinjiang. Everything is, halal, what is happening. There is nothing that is being done against the Muslims. All of this again demonstrates the fact that Beijing wants to whittle down their dependence on Rawalpindi, because particularly after the kidnapping of Chinese nationals in Islamabad, which I think took place around 2007, Beijing has become increasingly nervous, I think, about the ability of Pakistan alone to guarantee the safety and security of Beijing's interests, and to guarantee the safety and security of Chinese nationals who are on the ground in Pakistan. And the outreach essentially to the Taliban has been part of this effort at trying to break out on its own and diversify the basket of contacts that it has. Having said that, it's important to again keep in mind that, I think the specter of radicalism, the scale of radicalism emanating from Afghanistan vis-a-vis China, I think it is there, but I think it's blown grossly out of proportion by the Chinese. Afghanistan doesn't have a direct land border. Small 76-kilometer border, which till recently was not demarcated. It is not, traversable by foot. It's heavily guarded. So whatever radicalization will take place, it will actually take place through Pakistan and not so much essentially through Afghanistan. So I think the specter of radicalization emerging from Afghanistan has been blown out of proportion by the Chinese, essentially to cater to their own political ends. So you have radical elements, but not on the scale that the Chinese would like us to believe, right? But the fact that they attach importance to it is also seen in the fact, if you go back a little in history, when 2014 the quadrilateral talks were launched with the Taliban, one of the first things that the then NDS did was that they picked up about 10 or 15 Uyghur families who were in Kabul and deported them to China, to demonstrate the allegiance, to the Chinese that, well, we'll honor our word. You support the talks and we'll rein in the Uyghurs, however few they might be in number, right? So I think it's meant really to satiate the domestic audience. The Uyghur threat.
I didn't catch that. Could you try again?
Oops. So, I think the specter of radical threat from Afghanistan is overblown by China.
Thank you for patiently answering the questions, Dr. Raghav. Now I request Gauri to take over the platform.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raghav, for such an enriching session. And I think we've delved comprehensively into every facet of the situation and how you traced all the developments within Afghanistan and their role in shaping the larger regional landscape. We started by discussing the major misconceptions around Afghanistan in policy circles, and how, by some analysts, it has been termed as the victory of GHQ in Rawalpindi. It has also been called as if it's like the colonization of Afghanistan by Taliban and other reactionary Islamist groups. We discussed in detail the domestic fault lines and how they have been reconfigured since the 1990s. You spoke about the demographic bulge, the social heterogeneity, and the ethnicity, and the problems that arise from having such a heterogeneous ethnicity, and the developments in the countryside, and how there have been threats by the TPP to the civilian population. We also noted how the UN is becoming more involved in this whole scenario and the role of BRICS nations. For example, we discussed extensively the role of Beijing and its relationship with Afghanistan, how both the countries share, how China and Afghanistan share ideological similarities, and how China would look to reduce its dependence on Rawalpindi and expand the basket of options that it has. And importantly, we also discussed the role of India and how India must keep its channels open, for which I believe Taliban has set the precondition of impartiality from India's end. And the viable options for Indian diplomacy to engage with the Taliban, as you pointed out, one, I think, importantly, would be to follow up on its promises in the sphere of soft and structural power, specifically in the issue of e-visas, and to recalibrate implementation on that end. To also importantly step beyond the narrow domestic political considerations and the bureaucratic inertia that plagues our relations, to effectively de-hyphenate relations with the multiple adversaries that India finds in this region now. And lastly, I think India must also enhance relations with civil societies and non-governmental organizations in Afghanistan to restore the trust that it might have lost over the years. And a lot of other things that I might have missed out now. But thank you so much, Dr. Raghav and Mr. Veeresh, for sparing your time and for giving us such a holistic picture and delving into detail into every facet of this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Amananju?